Hi and welcome back to a new video. Today on my table I have the DeepCool LS720 AIO, which DeepCool sent to us for review, but then I thought just reviewing a single AIO might not be that interesting. That's why I decided to go to GIGABYTE, which is a price comparison website in Europe, quite popular, and decided to buy the most popular AIOs in Germany. We have already a selection on the table, for example, the Arctic Liquid Freezer 2, NZXT X73 Kraken AIO, then a Silent Loop 2 from bequiet, H150i from Corsair. That's already a selection. I still have more than those on the table. So I think even though they are all 360 AIOs, they are quite different when it comes to pricing and some of the features. So it could be quite interesting to check out what are the differences, especially then in the end, looking at price performance. We will test everything with the 12900 KS. I was thinking about if I would try with AM4 or with socket 1700. And right now, from my perspective, it makes most sense to do this with 12900K or 12900 KS, which I'm using, because this will be very close to the behavior of, let's say, a 13900K. Just like how the die is located, what kind of power draw we can see, for example. Whereas if we go with AM4, it will be a bit different to AM5. It's completely different IHS shape, and then could be quite different. So I think it will be more useful to test this on this CPU, also because it can theoretically draw a lot more power than AM4. One thing I also want to point out about the GIGABYTE popularity listing is that this is only showing how much clicks you get in the price comparison website. It does not reflect on how many of those units are actually sold. Could also be if there is a hype, like a bad hype around the product, that it could get a higher ranking because people are checking on this. So that's something you have to consider. It doesn't reflect sales, it's just pure clicks on the price comparison website. But let's go ahead and start with first AIO. We start with the least popular option, which is the bequiet Silent Loop 2. It is still a very popular AIO here in Germany. It is priced at about 150 euro right now. Just talking about the mounting mechanism itself, I would rate it as like a medium difficult mounting mechanism. It's not the easiest, but it's also not the most difficult. So we have a backplate. First of all, you have to get these standoffs fixed inside the backplate using those tiny O-rings. And then we will have to put these standoffs on top of the backplate. On the standoffs, you will mount these metal plates, which is one reason why I would not personally use this type of mounting mechanism for daily testing. For daily use, like a 24/7 rig, gaming rig, it's totally fine. But for me as a reviewer for testing like CPUs and mainboards and stuff, I don't like it because it blocks the ILM. So I cannot open this and replace the CPU without taking away those brackets. That's why I'm not a big fan of these for testing, but just for any kind of daily use, it's totally fine. And on top, you will just mount the AIO. For all AIOs in the test, I will use Cryonaut Extreme simply to just eliminate this as factor for temperature influence. I will run all the fans on this test of this tiny fan controller, and for the gaming test, I will run all AIOs at 40 dB. I generally decided to perform two tests. The first is the gaming test. I'm running PUBG with 10-minute warm-up phase, and then I'm drawing the average of all the cores, so every single core average of 15 minutes, and then the average of the average. Which then, for example, for the bequiet Silent Loop 2 results in an average core temperature of 39.5 degrees Celsius. That was at a noise level of maximum 40 dBA. The power consumption in this test was 76 watt continuously. For further evaluation of the cooling capacity, I decided to run the second test on full fan speed. That is Prime 95 with a duration of 15 minutes, again with 10 minutes warm up. It is a load of 260 watt continuously, and we had a noise level of 53.4 dBA. And a temperature of 82.5 degrees Celsius. So that will be the baseline, and the second AIO we're going to look at will be the Kraken X73. By the way, this is the thermal paste imprint we have on the Silent Loop 2. You can clearly see that there's a bit more paste in the center, which is exactly what we're trying to fight with the contact frame. But the reason I didn't use a contact frame here is simply because I want to get pretty much the stock conditions. You can always improve it, but that will depend on the very specific AIO. And the contact frame is also additional cost. So yeah, that's why I decided not to use it for this test. The X73 is what I would personally call the classic Ace-Tech AIO. It's a very solid product, at least from the base with the Ace-Tech design. It also has very simple mounting mechanisms. We have this backplate, it goes on the back of the board. Then we have those standoffs that go in here, and then just some thumb nuts to secure it. The Kraken X73 performed a little bit worse than the bequiet Silent Loop 2 in gaming with 40.5 degrees Celsius. But if we switch to continuous high load with about 260 watt under load, then the Kraken X73 performs slightly better with 78.8 degrees Celsius while having about the same noise level with 53.3 dBA. And I think that is related to the fans, because just subjectively speaking, if you put your hands in front of these fans, they seem to be a bit stronger than the bequiet fans. Continuing with the Arctic Liquid Freezer 2, which is a very cheap and also very popular AIO. It is priced at about 115 euro here in Germany. The mounting mechanism is a bit different from the others. We have to first attach those two metal plates left and right of the pump head. So that's a bit different to the other AIOs. And then we have this back plate where you have to place those standoffs on the mounting holes and then secure them with some O-rings. This goes underneath the mainboard. Then you would take those things which you could call like paper washers, like protection things, tape them on the hole, like on the mounting hole. I personally always stick them on the standoffs simply because then I don't have to stick them on the board. If I use something different, it will always stick to the standoff. Then just put on the pump head and secure it with the screws and you're good to go. At least temporary, the Arctic Liquid Freezer 2 is getting the crown in the gaming subtest with 38.5 degrees Celsius on average. If we switch over to high load, however, you can see that this type of AIO lacks max fan speed. But on the other hand, it's pretty quiet with 42.6 dBA. And it's still quite close to the Silent Loop 2, which is 11 dBA louder. So that's absolutely significant when it comes to noise level, but they almost perform the same. One of the main reasons why the Arctic Liquid Freezer 2 can perform so well is due to the fact that it's using a 35mm thick radiator, whereas most of the other AIOs only use a 25mm thick radiator. Next up is the Pure Loop 2 FX, again a bequiet AIO. First look, it could be similar to the Silent Loop, but it's definitely not. First of all, the pump is sitting here, which is quite interesting because it's like a double and coupling, you could call it, simply because we have a bit of tubing here and a lot of tubing here. So the pump is not sitting static inside the pump head. So this is not a pump head at all. It's just for like cooling head, you could probably call it, because there's no more pump in here. Pump is sitting in between the tubing, which could be better for like noise damping, less vibrations on the other components. So that could be interesting. And it's maybe also bypassing some patents. So very interesting design. Some RGB fans, but that's not really relevant for today's test. The mounting gear and mechanism is completely identical to the Silent Loop, so I will skip this on this AIO. Yeah, and I was wondering why the CPU is hitting like 99 degrees Celsius, why it's only clocking at 400 megahertz, and I was wondering if the pump is defect, but seems like I had one of these moments, you know. In our gaming test, the bequiet Pure Loop 2 FX performed, at least right now, the worst, with 43.5 degrees Celsius. That's actually worse than I expected. And if we now go over to maximum load with about 260 watt, also here we can find the bequiet Pure Loop 2 FX on the last spot, at least currently. And I also want to point out that with 86 degrees Celsius, it also happened that two of the cores were throttling once in a while. So two cores were hitting about 99 degrees Celsius and then downclocked. Seems like the Pure Loop 2 FX is on the cooling limit here. And even if the cooling capacity is maybe not enough, at least the box has very good content. The next AIO I have on my list is the H150i Elite Capellix from Corsair. It's in different versions on the list. So this is the white one. It's also listed twice with black one and different pump housing. But essentially the cooling capacity or cooling performance of all of them should be the same. I still had the white version laying around here, so that's simply why I'm going to use it. Mounting wise, it's a pretty simple A-stack mounting, the one I personally would prefer. So that goes to the back of the board. We have some standoffs, thumb screws, very simple. In the gaming test, the Corsair iQ H150i Elite is at least currently ranked on the second last spot with 42.3 degrees Celsius. But if we go full out, we can see that the Corsair fans just can be very strong, also quite loud with 54.9 dBA, but it's performing quite well with 79.2 degrees Celsius. The AORUS 360 AIO is one of the most popular in our test, at least according to the GIGABYTE data. It's available in an LCD and non-LCD version. This is the LCD one, which is actually not listed, but like cooling wise, it should just be exactly the same. That's why I'm not going to buy the same thing over again. Mounting wise, very simple. We have a backplate, some standoffs, thumb screws, ready to go. To my surprise, the GIGABYTE AIO really performed quite bad in the gaming test with almost 46 degrees Celsius. Like technically that's absolutely still fine for the CPU temperature, but just in comparison to the other AIOs, I was surprised that it's running rather warm. If we now switch to full load, it is ranked on the second last spot with 84 degrees Celsius. But that's also because the fans can spin quite high and because the AIO in this point is also quite loud. S360 is the most expensive AIO in today's test. It's about 240 euro, and I guess the most what you're paying for will be the LCD display and all the information you can display in here, such as like the core temperature, pump speed and so on. So the LCD is definitely different to the other AIOs, except for the GIGABYTE one. Mounting wise, also very simple. We have a backplate, standoffs, thumb screws. This chart shows again that the most expensive AIO doesn't mean that's also the best cooling AIO. It's still a solid performance with about 41 degrees Celsius under gaming load for the MSI MEG CoreLiquid S360. If we switch to maximum load, you can see that the fans cannot spin so high on the CoreLiquid S360. It peaks out at about 44 dBA and the temperature at about 85 with the second last spot. When it comes to AIOs, we all know that in the end there are only a tiny amount of real manufacturers. Most of them, like ASUS, MSI, AORUS, I think also bequiet, none of them really manufacture AIOs themselves. They just go to other manufacturers like, for example, Cooler Master, like Acetec, and then also, for example, DeepCool. So this could be different from all the other AIOs we tested so far, because looking at, let's say, the H150i should be Acetec Gen 6, then the NZXT Kraken X73 should be the Gen 7 Acetec, and so in the end there are not really a lot of real manufacturers, and DeepCool is one of them. That's why I think it could be quite interesting to test this LS720 AIO. Just talking about popularity, going back into the GIGABYTE listing, this is ranked like 50th or like 60th spot. So in Germany, nobody really cares about them. And I want to find out if it might make sense to care about them or maybe not. Just looking at the radiator itself and measured the thickness, it's 27mm thick, so it should be just in line to 99% of all the other AIOs which I tested so far, except for the Arctic one, I think. So the radiator itself is not really special, but what in theory technically is special is this anti-leak tag which is inside. We covered this about, I think, 3 years ago when we visited Computex last time. It means that there is like a rubber tube inside which can compensate pressure differences. Because just in theory talking, if we have the AIO fully filled with water, like with a liquid, that is not compressible, whereas air would be compressible. Sheik just joined us. Going back to the anti-leak tag, if we would have a little bit of air in there, it would help to compensate pressure differences. But on the other hand, you don't want to have any kind of air inside the AIO, and especially you don't want to have any air getting trapped inside the pump. That can be quite bad. And that's why having like a rubber tubing in here, which can be compressed or extended, can help to compensate pressure differences in both directions. So that's one thing that's kind of special about the radiator. The pump itself, we have some mirror finish on the pump housing. It looks quite nice. We'll look forward to see this illuminated. And then on the back we have a naked copper surface, not nickel plated, so definitely nothing for liquid metal. But generally I personally probably wouldn't use liquid metal on AIOs anyway. But if you just hold it a little bit against the light, you can see that it's slightly convex, which means that the center should be bound outwards by just a few micrometers, but that should help getting the best contact in the center. Most of the AIOs are trying to do this. Mounting wise, just a classical backplate with some screw standoffs that should easily go through the mainboard. These plastic things go on top to secure the backplate. And the last bit of preparation would be to add these metal plates left and right for mounting of the pump head. One thing DeepCool does a bit different to the others is the way they are attaching the fans to the pump head. So they only have one cable going from the pump head to the first fan, and then it's pretty much daisy chained. Kind of reminds me of the Li&Li AIO, except for that it's not a direct connection, but it's made with cables. Not quite sure why they made the cables so long though. I mean, you're just connecting fan to fan. Not quite sure about that. So they could have made the cabling a bit shorter, but that should in general just make it a bit easier for installation than if you compare it to the typical fan and RGB cable version. Looking at our results from the gaming test, the DeepCool LS720 definitely has a very good performance with about 40.2 degrees Celsius. Under full load, the DeepCool LS720 is placed in the middle of the field with a 3.2 degrees Celsius and also with a noise level of about 53 dBA. Important to me in the end is to also get a relation of the results to the price. In the gaming scenario, the Arctic Liquid Freezer 2 AIO is definitely the winner. The temperatures are really impressive and so is the price with 115 euro. But I also want to point out that it has a slightly thicker radiator than most of the other AIOs, and you definitely have to check if you will have enough clearance in your case. But in my opinion, the DeepCool LS720 can also be a strong recommendation because it's only slightly worse in the gaming scenario than the Arctic Liquid Freezer 2, but it comes with RGB fans and also, in my opinion, has a much better looking pump housing or cooling housing. And it's only 30 euro more. bequiet, Silent Loop 2 and NZXT Kraken are definitely also a strong recommendation because price-wise not much more expensive, but also very solid performance and subjectively speaking also very good looking, especially compared to the Liquid Freezer 2. I also want to point out that all the bequiet AIOs had nickel plating on the cold plate, which is different to the other AIOs in the test. And that could be a highlight if you want to go for liquid metal, which is something I would not recommend on AIOs. Looking at a price, it wouldn't really make much sense to recommend the MSI CoreLiquid or the AORUS Waterforce 360 or the Corsair H150i Elite Capellix. But then on the other hand, those come with additional features such as LCD display, IQ integration, and could theoretically fit also to other components you might have, such as Corsair memory or maybe your MSI mainboard or your AORUS graphics card. But we also have to look at the full out results with the full out CPU, just to check what kind of cooling potential is left both in pump and fans. But I also want to point out that in all of our testing, no matter if it was gaming testing or full out testing, the pump has always been running at 100% speed. But this right here could help you to further evaluate what kind of AIO would work for you. For example, if you're planning some tiny bench sessions in between, then I personally can also recommend the Kraken X73, Corsair H150i or the DeepCool LS720, simply because they have some cooling headroom with very strong fans and at the same time also offer very good mounting, which allows to easily swap the CPU with less steps in mounting. But also looking at this segment, the Liquid Freezer 2 from Arctic is also a winner. It might not have the lowest temperature, but if you now check the relation of the temperature to the very low fan speed and also low noise, I think this is quite impressive. I would definitely not recommend the bequiet PureLoop 2 FX360 because that was the only AIO in our testing that could not sustain the CPU clock at 260 watt continuously. That was maybe like 10 or 20 watt too much for this AIO, and in our case it started to throttle. I think personally for the GIGABYTE Waterforce 360 and also the MSI CoreLiquid 360, I think that also counts for an ASUS AIO. I wouldn't really recommend to use them. I think it might make sense to use them if you want to have a themed build where it should fit in just style-wise because you have all MSI build or whatever, then it might make sense. But otherwise, I think all of these like vendor AIOs like GIGABYTE, ASUS, MSI, those will always be the worst, I think, price performance wise. And one more thing I want to add is that GIGABYTE, finally, they have to fix their RGB software. It's so annoying to use. It's like incredibly bad programmed and there is like no development. Like over the years, GIGABYTE software just did not evolve. It just sucks. So yeah, GIGABYTE, please fix your stuff finally. In the end, time-wise, this video was much more than I originally expected. I think it was still quite interesting, but there was one more thing I wanted to test, and that's in theory testing all of them again with a contact frame, but I just didn't have time to do it. I just did it for one AIO and I specifically picked the GIGABYTE one because it was kinda also strangely performing the worst. It should have performed better, but you can see if I use a contact frame, I had a benefit of about 5.5 degrees Celsius. So it's definitely helping. And I guess most of the AIOs will be affected. Some will be affected more, some will be affected less by this. So that's something definitely to consider, that this platform is specifically bad for most of the coolers for testing. But I also wanted to point this out. Generally speaking though, it just won't matter at all. If you're a gamer, if you want to play with your system, like your CPU is not going to care if your cores are sitting at like 60 or 70 degrees Celsius, and all of those AIOs would work theoretically. But then again, it might also make sense to look at a price depending on what you are looking for your build. I hope this video was interesting for you. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time. Bye bye.